Welcome back. In this lab, we will go over how to deploy an application load balancer with two EC2 instances. The EC2 instances will have an HTML page that will display their internal IP address. Let's get started. In our EC2 console page, we will first launch our two EC2 instances. So I will click on the Launch Instances button. For this lab, we can use the Amazon Linux 2 AMI for both of our instances. We can also use the T2 micro instance type. So I'll click on Next. We can leave our instance configuration with its default configuration, except we will configure our subnet to be US East 1A. And we will paste in the EC2 user data script that I have provided in the course resource section of this course. And as you can see, the user data script will be creating a web server with a red H1 tag that will display the internal IP address. We can then click on the Configure Security Group tab at the top. Because I won't be adding tags, and I'm okay with the default storage type AWS has selected for me, I will click on the Existing Security Group option and then select my EC2-Lab security group. This security group has all the rules we need for our lab to work, so this works for me. We can then click on the Review and Launch, and then click on Launch. I will then acknowledge that I have my EC2-Lab RSA key pair, and then click on Launch Instance. We can then click on View Instances, and this should take us back to our Instances page. We can now proceed to launching our second EC2 instance. We can right-click on our instance that we have already deployed, go to Images and Templates, and then click on Launch More like this. This will copy all the settings from our first EC2 instance. But I do want to change a couple of things, so I will click on the Configure Instance tab. I will first change my subnet to be US East 1B. Changing the subnet to US East 1B is essentially making our application run across two availability zones instead of one. We can then scroll all the way down to the bottom, and in our user data script, I will simply change my H1 color to blue. After changing these two things, I will go to the Review tab and then click on Launch. I will again confirm that I have the EC2-Lab RSA key and then click on Launch Instances. After it launches, we can go back to our EC2 instance page, and we should now have our two servers. If we click on the first server we launched, under Instance Summary, we should be able to see our public IPv4 address. We can copy this address and paste it in our web browser. Once the page loads, we should now see our internal IP address in red. If we go back to our EC2 instance page and click on the second server we deployed, we should now be able to copy the public IP address and do the same. We should now see the internal IP address in blue. Now, what do you think we should do next? That's right, we need to deploy our load balancer. If we go to the left-hand side and scroll to the bottom, we should see Load Balancers under Load Balancing. We can click on that option, and this should take us to a new page. We can then click on Create Load Balancer option. In the new page, we should see four options. We have the Application Load Balancer, the Network Load Balancer, the Gateway Load Balancer, and if we scroll down a bit, we have the deprecated Classic Load Balancer. Out of these options, which do you think we should select? That's right, the Application Load balancer because we are testing our HTTP application because our web page runs at the layer 7 of the OSI model. So under Application Load Balancer, let's click on Create. I will name my load balancer ZTM-ALB. And we can leave the scheme as internet facing because we want to be able to reach it via the internet. For the IP address type, I will leave mine as IPv4. Under the VPC option, we can leave it with the default VPC. Under mappings, I will select all the availability zones, although we could just select US East 1A and US East 1B if we wanted to, because that is where we deployed our EC2 instances. But just in case we change our mind in the future, I will select all the availability zones in the region. And I will leave the subnet that is assigned by AWS as it is. Under security groups, I will also add in our EC2-Lab security group. And if we scroll down a bit, under listeners and routing, we can leave the protocol as HTTP with port 80. But we need to define a target group. So we can click on Create Target Group since we haven't created one yet, and this should open up a new tab. For our target group, we can leave the target type as instances since we will be load balancing EC2 instances. And I will name my target group ZTM-TG. For the health checks, we can leave them as HTTP. These health checks basically will check if our EC2 instances are healthy and are running. And everything else in this page we can leave in its default configuration. So I will click on Next. We can now register our EC2 instance to the application load balancer. So I will select both of our EC2 instances and then click on Include as Pending below. This will first check the health status of both of our EC2 instances before routing traffic to them. Once the health check has passed, then the target group will automatically route the traffic to our EC2 instances. We can click on Create Target Group. We can then click on our target group and then click on the Targets tab, which should display both of our EC2 instances. Under this tab, we could also choose to register more targets if we wanted to in the future. We can now go back to our Application Load Balancer tab and click on the refresh icon to see our ZTM-TG target group. We can then scroll down and see a summary of our configuration. Since everything looks good to me, I will click on Create Load Balancer. As you can see, our Application Load Balancer is in the provisioning state, which means it's not fully available. So I will wait a couple of minutes and then come back. After a couple of minutes, we can click on the refresh icon in the top right-hand corner and see if our state has changed to active. After the state has changed to active, we can now copy our DNS name, which is a URL we can use to access our load balancer, and we can paste it in a new window. As you can see, the DNS name is routing us to one of our EC2 instances. If we click on the refresh icon, we should now see the color of the H1 change and the internal IP address change because the application load balancer is balancing the traffic between the two EC2 instances. Now, if you want to follow along with the lab that is coming up in the next video, you can go ahead and just terminate the two EC2 instances we deployed in this lab. We can keep the application load balancer and the target group in place because we will need them. Now I want to quickly recap what we just did. We created two EC2 instances and placed them both inside of a target group. We then created our application load balancer and routed our traffic to our target group. All of this put together allowed us to load balance our application across 2 availability zones, thus creating a highly available application. I hope you feel more comfortable with application load balancers. I'll see you in the next video.